The man next to you just pulled out a tooth with his bare fingers. Not a loose tooth, a molar. He twisted, yanked, spat blood onto the dirt floor, and kept eating like nothing happened. The bone still had pieces of gum tissue clinging to it. You are sitting 2 feet away from him. What's on your plate is salted goat meat, hard as old wood, boiled with onion and something you can't identify by smell alone. The bowl it was served in hasn't been washed since yesterday, or the day before. The fat from the last meal is still crusted along the rim. You run your thumb across it. That film on your thumb? That's several days of other people's food. Now, here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. This is a good meal. This is a feast-adjacent evening. The longhouse is full, the fire is burning, and by Viking Age standards, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, across Scandinavia and the Norse settlements that stretched from Iceland to the British Isles, this is comfort. This is prosperity. This is what surviving winter looks like. You would not last a season. Not because you're weak, not because you're cowardly, but because your immune system, your pain tolerance, your baseline relationship with your own body, none of it was built for this world. You were raised in an era of antibiotics, filtered water, and germ theory. They were raised in an era where the infection that killed you was simply called fate. This narrative will show you exactly why. Not through the lens of glory or mythology. Not through the romanticized version with the clean hair and the dramatic helmets. Through the body. Through the skin, the teeth, the gut, the hands. Through what it actually felt like to be physically alive in Scandinavia 1,000 years ago. The longhouse where you're sitting right now is approximately 30 meters long and 8 meters wide. 60 people sleep here. Some animals, too, goats and chickens during the harshest months, because their body heat is too valuable to waste outside.
The ceiling is low. There are no windows. The smoke from the central hearth is supposed to escape through a hole in the roof, but wind direction is unpredictable. And tonight the smoke is sitting low, thick enough to sting your eyes. You've been inside for 4 hours, and your lungs already feel coated. Chronic respiratory illness was so common among Viking Age populations that archaeologists find evidence of it in skeletal remains. Thickened bone tissue around the sinuses, signs of persistent inflammation. People coughed constantly. You would assume they were sick. They would not understand the distinction you're making. The man with the missing tooth is now licking the bowl. His name, in another life, might have been Bjorn. He is 34 years old, which means he is, statistically, closer to the end of his life than the beginning. The average life expectancy in Norse communities during this period hovered somewhere between 40 and 50 years, though that number is dragged down sharply by child mortality. If you made it past childhood, you might reach 60, but your body would look 80. Bjorn's hands are the color of old leather. The knuckles are split in 3 places, currently scabbing. He has not washed them today. There is no mechanism by which he would wash them before touching food. The concept of hand washing as disease prevention does not exist, will not exist for another 800 years. You just ate from the same pot he served himself from. You haven't bathed in 11 days. That's not negligence. That's not poverty. That's just Saturday, or whatever the Norse equivalent of an ordinary stretch of time feels like when the river is frozen and the nearest bathhouse is a half-day's walk through snow that comes up to your knee. Hot water requires fire. Fire requires wood. Wood requires labor. And labor, in a subsistence economy running on human muscle and animal fat, is a finite and precious resource that does not get spent on personal comfort.
Here's the thing that surprises most people. Vikings were actually considered unusually clean by medieval European standards. Let that sit for a moment. Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Norse Rus traders along the Volga River in 921 AD and documented the meeting in meticulous detail, described them as the filthiest people God had ever created. He watched them pass a single bowl of water between 60 men to wash their faces and blow their noses into. One bowl, sequential, no rinsing between uses. He was horrified. He wrote it down. The document survived. And yet, compared to their contemporaries in Anglo-Saxon England and Frankish Europe, Norse people bathed more frequently, combed their hair more regularly, and showed greater concern with personal grooming. English chroniclers from the 10th century complained that Danish settlers were stealing their women partly because the Danes bathed once a week on Saturdays, Laugardaugar, literally washing day, while Englishmen might go months without. Once a week was considered impressive. You showered daily, possibly twice if you exercised. Your skin microbiome has been shaped by decades of soap, hot water, and synthetic fabrics that wick moisture away from the body. Strip all of that away, and what replaces it is a living ecosystem you have no modern framework for tolerating. Within 2 weeks of living as they lived, your skin would begin to change. The natural oils your body produces, sebum, would build up across your scalp, your face, the creases behind your ears, the back of your neck. Not unpleasantly at first, then dramatically. Your hair would clump and harden into something closer to felt than fiber. The friction from wool clothing worn directly against skin that is never fully clean creates a particular kind of abrasion, slow, relentless, invisible until it isn't. Viking Age clothing was predominantly wool. Wool against unwashed skin day after day
In a body that sweats and works and bleeds occasionally, breeds exactly the kind of warm, moist, protein-rich environment that parasites find irresistible. Lice. Not metaphorically, literally. Archaeological evidence from Norse combs, and they did use combs, fine-toothed ones carved from antler and bone, found in burial sites across Scandinavia, Iceland, and the Danelaw, shows consistent physical traces of head lice eggs. Knit combs were not a luxury item. They were functional, daily tools, the same way you use a toothbrush. Except the toothbrush doesn't always work. And sometimes the lice win, and you simply continue your day. You would find this unbearable within 72 hours. There's a specific sensation. If you've ever had lice as a child, you remember it. That phantom crawling feeling at the scalp that makes your whole body tighten. Now imagine that sensation is real, constant, and not a crisis. Imagine scratching your head during dinner and having that be unremarkable. Imagine your children having it. Imagine treating it with the same emotional register you use to treat a mild headache. That normalization is what would break you first. Not the cold, not the hunger, not the violence, though the violence would come. The slow, grinding realization that your body is never entirely your own, that something is always living on you, in you, with you. That cleanliness, as a concept, is something your civilization invented much later, and that the version of you that exists right now, the one reading this, the one with clean fingernails and conditioned hair, is a very recent and very fragile construction. Bjorn scratched his head 3 times during dinner. He didn't notice. Your tongue finds the gap before your brain does. One morning you wake up, and there's a new space in your mouth where something solid used to be. Not dramatic, no explosion of pain in the night, just absence.
A tooth that was loose for 3 weeks finally gave up its grip on the gum sometime between midnight and dawn. And now there's a raw socket that your tongue keeps returning to, the way a finger finds a fresh cut. You are 28 years old. You will lose 4 more before you're 40. Dental health in Viking Age Scandinavia was catastrophically bad by modern standards. and fascinatingly specific in its patterns. Archaeological analysis of Norse skeletal remains shows widespread evidence of caries, cavities, but not from sugar, which was essentially unavailable to common people. From grain. The diet was heavily dependent on coarsely ground cereals, and that coarseness was the problem. Stone-ground flour, produced by hand mills called querns, consistently introduced tiny fragments of grit and stone dust into the bread. Every loaf, every day. That grit acted like slow sandpaper against tooth enamel, wearing it down over years until the inner pulp was exposed and infection moved in quietly and permanently. The pain was chronic, low-grade, background noise. You know that specific toothache that wakes you up at 3 a.m. and makes you press your palm against your cheek because the pressure somehow helps? The one that makes you Google emergency dentists at 4 a.m. and consider driving to the hospital. That pain, that exact category of desperate, jaw-clenching, sleep-destroying pain was simply a feature of adulthood for a significant percentage of the Norse population. Something you learned to carry, something you ate around. There was no dentist. There was no numbing agent that worked reliably. There was willow bark tea, which contains salicin, a compound chemically related to aspirin. And there were plant-based remedies involving henbane and juniper that Norse healers, often women, administered with genuine knowledge and genuine care. They worked, sometimes, partially, enough to keep functioning. Functioning is the operative word. Nobody stopped working because of tooth pain.
A bad tooth was not a reason to rest. You would split wood, haul water, repair nets, sail into weather that would make a modern Coast Guard issue warnings, all with an infected molar sitting in your jaw like a slow fire you've learned to ignore. But here's what shifts the story sideways. Some of them had surprisingly good teeth. This is the part that researchers didn't expect. Skeletal analysis of higher-status Norse individuals, those buried with weapons, jewelry, imported goods, shows markedly better dental health than their lower-status contemporaries. Not perfect, but measurably different. The difference wasn't toothbrushing. It was diet. Specifically, access to protein over grain. Meat and fish, the foods of people who could afford them, were dramatically less destructive to enamel than the carbohydrate-heavy diet of subsistence farmers grinding their own flour. Your teeth, in this world, were a class marker. Look at someone's mouth, and you could read their entire economic biography. The Norse did clean their teeth. Wooden picks, small knives, sometimes fibrous plant material used as a rudimentary brush. Mint and various herbs were used as breath fresheners. Vanity existed. The desire to be presentable existed. But the tools available were so far removed from what your mouth requires now that the gap is almost comic. You brush your teeth twice a day with a fluoride compound developed through decades of biochemical research, applied with a tool engineered specifically for the geometry of human dentition, and you still get cavities occasionally and consider it a minor personal failure. They had a knife and some mint, and they kept sailing. There's something almost unreasonable about that. The Norse expansion, the raids, the trade routes, the settlements in Greenland, and the brief extraordinary landfall in North America around 1000 AD at Lons aux Meadows in Newfoundland. All of it was executed by people with rotting teeth, lice in their hair, infected skin abrasions, and lungs half filled with hearth smoke. They didn't conquer despite their bodies. They conquered with them. That distinction matters. Because what you're really confronting here isn't just discomfort. It's the realization that the human body, your body, is capable of adaptation so radical it becomes unrecognizable. The version of physical existence you consider baseline normal, the pain-free, parasite-free, infection-managed version, is not the default setting of the species. It's a recent luxury. And luxury, as anyone in a longhouse in 10th century Norway could tell you, is the first thing that disappears when the weather turns. You are thirsty. Not the casual thirst of a warm afternoon, the specific animal thirst of a body that hasn't had clean water since 2 days ago, when the snow you melted over the fire turned out to taste like smoke and ash and something vaguely organic that you chose not to investigate. You drank it anyway. You drank it fast, because hesitation in this climate is its own kind of death sentence, and your body needed the liquid more than your mind needed the comfort of certainty. That was a mistake. You'll know in about 6 hours. Waterborne illness was among the leading causes of death in Viking Age communities, and the brutal irony is that the people most affected often had no framework for understanding why. The connection between contaminated water and gastrointestinal disease, the vomiting, the cramping, the catastrophic dehydration that follows, was invisible to them in the way that the connection between a specific behavior and a specific consequence requires germ theory to see clearly. Germ theory arrives in the 19th century. You are standing in the 10th. What they knew, practically, was that certain water sources were safer than others. Running water over clean rock, melted snow from high elevation, fermented drinks, ale, mead, skyr, the thin, soured milk that was a dietary staple, were safer than standing water because the fermentation process killed many pathogens as a side effect. This wasn't understood microbiologically. It was understood empirically, the way you learn not to touch a hot surface, not because you understand thermodynamics, but because you did it once and remember the result. Norse children drank diluted ale. Infants, once weaned, were given fermented dairy products before water, not as a cultural curiosity, as survival strategy, arrived at through generations of watching children die from the alternative. You would find this shocking. They found it Tuesday. Now add the following to your body's current inventory. You have a cut on your left hand, approximately 2 centimeters long, from a slip with a knife 3 days ago. It was bound with a strip of linen and forgotten. This morning, the skin around it is warm and slightly swollen, and there's a thin line of redness extending maybe a centimeter up toward your wrist. You notice it. You don't have language for what it means. You have no concept of bacterial infection, no understanding that invisible organisms are currently multiplying in your tissue, no awareness that the red line is a directional signal pointing toward your lymphatic system and, eventually, toward your bloodstream. What you have is a poultice of yarrow and honey applied by the settlement's healer, a woman whose knowledge of wound care was genuinely sophisticated by the standards available to her. Honey has real antimicrobial properties. Yarrow was used across multiple ancient medical traditions for a reason. These treatments worked often enough to be trusted completely, and failed often enough that death from minor wounds was simply a known risk of being alive. Sepsis from small cuts killed people regularly. Not warriors in battle, farmers, fishermen, women in childbirth, children who fell and scraped their knees on the wrong rock in the wrong season. The dramatic deaths, the raids, the axes, the storms at sea, those were real, but they competed statistically with the quiet deaths. The ones that started with something you would treat today with a 5-day course of antibiotics and a bandage from a gas station. That is the gap. That specific gap between your infected hand and a pharmacy is the true measure of the distance between your world and theirs. By the end of the Viking Age, as contact with Christian Europe increased and monastic medical traditions began filtering northward, Norse medical practice was already evolving.
The sagas themselves contain descriptions of wound care, battlefield surgery, and herbal treatment that reflect genuine accumulated knowledge. A 13th century Icelandic text describes a field triage method for spinal injuries that involved feeding the wounded man a broth of onion and leek, then smelling the wound. If the odor of allium came through the injury, the wound penetrated the gut cavity and was fatal. If not, survivable. That's not superstition. That's applied biochemistry, arrived at without biochemistry. They were not primitive. They were operating at the absolute frontier of human knowledge with the tools their moment in history made available. The same way every generation does. The same way you are, right now, making medical decisions based on the best available science of 2026 that will look barbaric or laughably incomplete to people reading about this century from a distance of 1,000 years. That's the part that stays with you after the smell fades and the tooth stops throbbing and the water finally runs clear. You weren't weaker than Bjorn. You were just born later. And later, it turns out, comes with advantages so profound and so invisible that you only see them clearly when someone takes them away. When you're sitting in a smoke-filled longhouse with a cut on your hand and something alive in your hair and a tooth that's been hurting for 3 weeks.
Watching a man lick a bowl clean and understanding finally that this is not hardship. This is just life. The hardship was surviving it.